Darren always believed in doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. He had grown up in Chicago's South Side, a neighborhood where opportunities were scarce and survival often meant bending the rules. Darren, however, had a deep sense of morality instilled in him by his mother, a woman who had raised him alone and taught him that kindness was never wasted. That same kindness had landed him a job as a waiter at the Briarwood, one of the city's upscale restaurants. To Darren, the job was more than a paycheck. It was a stepping stone toward a life where he could finally breathe easy, away from the constant struggle of bills, rent, and the precarious balancing act of keeping his dreams alive. The Briarwood was a beautiful place, polished wood floors, crystal chandeliers, and a menu that could make even the pickiest food critic swoon. Darren, despite his background, had learned quickly how to navigate the polished veneer of the place. He was meticulous, always polite, and had a quiet charm that customers seemed to notice. But beneath his calm exterior, Darren carried a weight that most of his colleagues could never understand. Every morning, on his way to work, he would pass a man named Henry, sitting on the cold concrete outside the 7-Eleven at the corner of Monroe Street. Henry was homeless, his clothes tattered, his beard thick and unkempt, and his eyes carried a kind of weariness that only life on the streets could produce. Henry never asked for much. Most days, he simply nodded at Darren with a weary smile as Darren passed by, his own hands clutching a coffee cup to ward off the cold. But Darren knew that nod wasn't enough. He couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his chest, the knowledge that Henry went to bed every night without a meal, without a roof over his head. It was this silent torment that made Darren do something impulsive one chilly October evening. The Briarwood was packed that night. A private party had rented out half the restaurant, and Darren was running back and forth, trying to ensure every guest had a flawless dining experience. Plates clattered, glasses chimed, and the air was thick with laughter and the smell of seared salmon. But in the back of his mind, Darren couldn't shake the image of Henry huddled on the curb, shivering. By the time his shift was halfway done, Darren had made a decision. He slipped into the kitchen during a lull and grabbed a fresh loaf of bread from the storage room. It wasn't fancy, just a simple artisanal loaf, but to Henry, it would mean warmth and sustenance. Darren wrapped it in a brown paper bag, hesitated for a moment, and then slipped out through the side door. The night air hit him like a wave, colder than he had anticipated, but he didn't care. He walked quickly toward the corner, heart pounding in his chest, worried about being caught, worried about the consequences, but more worried about Henry's empty stomach. Henry looked up as Darren approached, surprised to see anyone from the outside world taking notice. Darren crouched down and handed him the bread, their eyes meeting in a way that spoke volumes, gratitude, shame, and a shared understanding of struggle. Henry's hands shook as he took the loaf, and he whispered a quiet thank you that went straight to Darren's heart. You shouldn't do this," Henry muttered, but Darren just smiled, shaking his head. "Some things are worth doing, no matter what," he replied, before slipping back into the shadows, his conscience slightly eased, yet unknowingly setting a chain of events in motion that would turn his life upside down. The next morning, Darren arrived at work to the crisp smell of polished wood and brewed coffee, expecting nothing more than another busy day. But within the first hour, he was called into the manager's office. Jerome, a man who prided himself on discipline and order, sat behind a massive mahogany desk, arms crossed. Darren immediately sensed something was wrong. "Darren," Jerome began, his tone measured but sharp. "We've received complaints about staff behavior after hours. Specifically, giving away restaurant property." Darren felt a chill crawl down his spine. His mind raced, realizing Jerome had found out about the bread. He tried to explain, his voice trembling. "Sir, I just wanted to help. The man was hungry, and You overstepped boundaries," Jerome cut in, his face stern. "We have rules for a reason. I'm afraid we have no choice but to terminate your employment effective immediately." Darren felt as if the floor had dropped beneath him. All the months of hard work, the careful attention to customers, the late nights, gone. He tried to protest, but Jerome was immovable. Darren left the office, the crisp morning air doing nothing to ease the knot of disappointment in his chest. But worse than the job loss was the sting of humiliation. In a city where people already judged him by the color of his skin and the weight of his wallet, losing his job over a loaf of bread felt like a cruel reminder of how fragile his dreams were. For the next few days, Darren wandered the city in a haze, trying to figure out what to do next. He applied for jobs, but doors seemed to close before he could even step through them. Bills piled up. Rent reminders turned into late notices. His mother, who had always been his rock, noticed the change immediately. One evening, as they sat at their small kitchen table eating instant noodles, she reached across and took his hand. "Darren," she said softly, "you did the right thing. Sometimes the right thing doesn't pay off immediately, but it always comes back around." Darren wanted to believe her, but the weight of reality made it difficult. Meanwhile, Henry had not forgotten the kindness Darren had shown him. With the bread in his hands, Henry had managed to survive a few extra days without scrounging or going hungry. He was older than Darren, but there was a dignity in him that made Darren feel small and yet inspired. Henry began telling other people in the city about the young man who had shown him compassion. A social media post from a local community activist caught wind of the story, posting a short account of a young waiter who had risked his job to feed a man in need. Darren had no idea that the post was going viral. He was still trudging through life, unsure how to keep his head above water, when one afternoon he received a call that would alter everything. It was from a local nonprofit organization that focused on helping the homeless. They had heard about his story and wanted him to speak at an event, sharing his perspective on empathy and human kindness. Darren hesitated, his insecurities flaring. What could he, a young man recently fired for a loaf of bread, possibly contribute to such an event? But with a deep breath, he accepted. The day of the event, Darren stood nervously in front of a crowd much larger than he had ever imagined. His hands shook slightly, but as he looked into the audience and saw the attentive faces, people who genuinely cared, he found his voice. He spoke about Henry, about the struggles he had witnessed in the city, and about the simple act of giving that had cost him his job. By the time he finished, there wasn't a single dry eye in the room. People came forward, not with judgment, but with support, encouragement, and offers to collaborate on community initiatives. Little did Darren know, one of the attendees was a local restaurateur known for supporting social causes and providing second chances to young workers who had potential but faced obstacles. After the event, she approached Darren with a warm smile. "I've been looking for someone like you," she said. "Someone who understands people, not just food. I'd like to offer you a position at my restaurant. Not just as a waiter, but in a role where you can make decisions and help train others." Darren felt a rush of emotions, relief, gratitude, disbelief. For the first time in weeks, he truly felt seen. And more importantly, he realized that the act of kindness that had seemed so small, so inconsequential at the time, had created ripples far beyond his imagination. The very thing that had threatened to ruin his life had instead opened a door he hadn't even known existed. Darren's first week at the new restaurant, called Haven Table, was unlike anything he had experienced before. The atmosphere was still professional, but it had a warmth that the Briarwood lacked. Staff members weren't just employees, they were partners in creating a space that treated both customers and the community with care. Darren quickly realized that this wasn't just a job, it was an opportunity to shape an environment where kindness wasn't punished but celebrated. On his second day, Darren was introduced to the restaurant's community outreach program. They worked closely with local shelters, food banks, and organizations helping those struggling with homelessness. Darren's eyes lit up as he realized he could merge his passion for service with meaningful action. For the first time, he felt like his past struggles weren't burdens, they were lessons that had prepared him to make a real impact. One afternoon, while sorting food donations, Darren spotted a familiar figure in the parking lot. Henry, with the same tired eyes but now wearing a slightly cleaner jacket, looked hesitant. Darren ran toward him, a wide smile spreading across his face. Henry. You made it, he exclaimed. Henry's face brightened with a mix of surprise and relief. I wasn't sure I could, Henry said, his voice trembling. Things haven't been easy. Darren shook his head. You're not alone anymore. You've got people who care. And I'm one of them. Over the next few weeks, Darren helped Henry find a temporary shelter, assisted with job applications, and even taught him basic computer skills. Henry's transformation was gradual but undeniable. The man who once sat quietly on a cold sidewalk now carried himself with a hint of pride, a spark in his eyes that Darren had never seen before. The restaurant began hosting monthly community dinners, inviting both the less fortunate and regular patrons to share a meal. Darren was instrumental in organizing these events. He remembered how it felt to be powerless, watching someone suffer without being able to help. Now, he was in a position to make a tangible difference. Families who had nowhere to go for a warm meal found comfort at Haven Table. Children laughed, stories were shared, and Darren realized that a single act of kindness, the loaf of bread, had come full circle, multiplying into something much larger. However, not everything was smooth. One evening, a group of patrons complained about seeing homeless people at the restaurant. Darren's heart sank, and for a moment, he questioned whether he was doing the right thing. But as he looked around at the volunteers, the staff, and Henry helping serve dishes, he realized that changing hearts sometimes required patience. He approached the patrons calmly, explaining the restaurant's mission. By the end of the night, most of them had not only apologized but also pledged to support future events. As months passed, Darren's efforts gained wider recognition. Local news outlets ran features on Haven Table, highlighting how a young man's simple act of kindness had sparked a movement within the community. Darren was invited to speak at schools, inspiring students to recognize that compassion and courage often outweigh fear and conformity. One particularly cold December evening, Darren walked home after a long day at the restaurant. Snowflakes drifted lazily around him, but he felt a warmth in his chest that he hadn't known in years. He passed by the corner of Monroe Street, and there was Henry, smiling and holding a small bag of groceries. "Merry Christmas, Darren," Henry said. "I couldn't have made it without you." Darren felt a lump in his throat. "You did all the hard work, Henry. I just helped you see it." That night, as Darren sat with his mother in their modest apartment, he reflected on how far he had come. Losing his job at the Briarwood had felt like the end of the world, yet it had led him to a place where his values were honored, his efforts appreciated, and his actions had a ripple effect that changed countless lives. He realized that sometimes, the right choice wasn't the easiest, and the kindest act wasn't the most convenient, but it was always the most powerful. Darren's story became a reminder that life's setbacks can be disguised blessings. A loaf of bread, a simple gesture of compassion, had reshaped his destiny, Henry's future, and the lives of everyone who walked through Haven Table's doors. And in the end, Darren understood that true success wasn't measured by a paycheck or prestige, it was measured by the difference one could make in the lives of others.